our own consciousness, most of us, people like you and me who take part in and watch podcasts, we have a very complex form of consciousness. And so we take that for granted. That's what we mean by consciousness, this stuff that you and I are busy engaging in now. But that's an extremely highly developed, complex, compound form of consciousness. It even goes beyond what I've just said to you. So I think first we have feeling. Secondly, we have feeling extending onto objects. Thirdly, we are able to abstract ourselves from that situation and recognize, oh, it is me. I too am an object. It is me who is feeling that about her. So that's the third person perspective. And that's where most of us live. We live up there in abstract thoughts about our thoughts and feelings. Freud spoke of the libidinal drive being taking the self as its object, and then you have to move to taking an object, outside object, as your love object. But once you start recognizing that the object too has needs, the object too is a subject, then you start being able to love. And it involves a state of vulnerability. I keep on coming back to that. To have a successful, loving relationship is not easy. The pain of separation is the risk we have to take in order to properly attach to somebody. I remember the moment when I recognized my firstborn child was separate from me. It was an actual realization, was, oh my God, he has his own mind. The most interesting thing about the brain is the fact that it feels like something to be a brain. What most people think of as objective reality is also their subjective representation of it. And then we need a language which can unify both of those. And this is why I consider myself a dual aspect monist. Our feelings have causal consequences. It alters what the rest of the body and brain does, the fact that it feels like something to be one. So I think that it is an absolute necessity and a wonder. I'm thrilled to be studying it just because it's so fascinating, but it is also an absolute obligation on neuroscience and the whole of biology and the whole of natural science to integrate subjectivity into its Weltanschauung, as they say in German. Bringing all of this together in romantic love is an enormous achievement.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Love and Philosophy. This is part 2 with Mark Solms, who's a neuroscientist, neuropsychologist. I had a conversation with him about feeling as the hidden spring last year, and we talked about love, but we didn't actually mention the word love, I don't think. So this is part 2 where we start with love and the word love and discuss that through his work, through the idea of subjectivity and objectivity. I won't try and give you a summary of this because Mark himself explains everything very well. We do mention Jonathan Lear and a book which I will put in the show notes about Freud and love as a basic force of human nature, which is interesting and which you might remember from the conversation I had with Alva Noe. The only little thing I wish I had asked is if he really meant that we are brains who know we are brains, because of course the embodied people out there would understand that we're bodies who know that we have brains. So maybe next time I talk to Mark, I'll try and clarify that a bit. I'm going to post 2 or 3 conversations in the next week or so, just as bonus, and some ideas I'm trying to work through in my research relative to this idea of empowerment in AI. I'm going to post that coming soon. And then another one, a philosophical one. So there's a few different kinds of options coming for those of you. I know some of you are more interested in these sorts of conversations, like the one with Mark, and others more in the artificial intelligence, others more in the philosophy. So this week, everyone gets something, and I hope that it brings something good to you. It's a lot of good people doing good work that I want to share with you. And it's been quite a start to the year already. I hope you're all doing well. Sending you love and philosophy. Anything you want to ask me before we jump in, or shall we just...
No, I'm fine. And I read the emails you sent, so I don't know why you sent me a question mark. The last thing you sent me was a question mark, but I thought maybe that was...
Really? A question mark?
Yeah.
I don't know. Oh, you know what? It's probably on my phone. I think I just hit a heart, and maybe it doesn't show up as the emoji didn't show up.
Okay, good.
So it was actually a heart,
good.
but you got.
Good.
Maybe it shows up on the email.
I prefer a heart to a question mark.
Yeah, it was definitely a heart. I didn't send you a question mark, but I have seen sometimes the emojis just come through like that.
Yes,
so,
of course.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Mark. Nice to see you again. We already said hi, but for everyone out there, hello.
Hello, Andrea. Good to see you too.
So last time we didn't talk about the big 4-letter word, LOVE. So we're having another little session here to add on to that one. And I guess just to get started, here's a question. Is love a feeling in the way that you use the word?
Yes, of course, love is a feeling, and it's a lot more than a feeling, which I think points to the fact that it's not in my view, love is not a elemental emotion. It's a composite of a number of more basic things. I suppose I should also add, there's not only one kind of love. I'm aware that this is a major feature of your podcast, so I'm probably bringing coals to Newcastle by saying things like this, but I'll give you my view on this subject as if you know nothing about it. So I suppose the major kind of love that the word conjures up is romantic love. And so I've already said, I think of love as a composite state of mind. So let me illustrate it with romantic love. The first thing that, in terms of, let me just remind us all as well of what the basic emotional dispositions are, according to the taxonomy that is most authoritative in affective neuroscience, namely that of Jaak Panksepp. There's lust, and there's seeking, and there's rage, and there's fear, and there's care, and there's play. And forgive me if I left anything out, there meant to be 7 of them. So romantic love involves love, of course. Otherwise, it's not romantic. In other words, it involves sexuality. And it doesn't involve only sexuality. In fact, sexuality left to its own devices doesn't even need a partner. You can just masturbate and satisfy the sexual tensions that come with lust in and of itself. So that leads to the second, obviously major component of a loving relationship, a romantic relationship, namely that it's not only romantic, it's also a relationship. So there's attachment involved. And there are 2 attachment drives. In fact, I think the one I didn't mention a moment ago is panic/grief. So there are 2 attachment drives. One of them is the one, odd name as it is, what it boils down to is the need to be cared for, the need to be cared about, the need to be wanted and needed and attended to, and so on. So that in a romantic relationship, you want sexually somebody's relationship with you, but you want also lovingly that person's relationship with you. You want the sexual relationship to be embedded within a deeper, richer, fuller connection with each other. And that leads me immediately to the third component, which is the other attachment drive called care. We don't only need to be cared for, we need, and thank God it is a need, we need to care for others. It's a sort of a nurturing drive, the so-called maternal instinct, but that's obviously a misnomer because it doesn't only arise in mothers. And incidentally, let me just add now already that if you don't integrate all of these, and I haven't yet finished my listing, but if you don't integrate all of these more elementary emotional needs into a romantic relationship, then that relationship's in trouble, because it has to involve romance in the sense of sexuality, but it also has to involve caring relationship in both directions. You have to care about each other, which leads to another not frequently recognized aspect of relating, which is affective neuroscience called play, which, despite the word, well, the word conjures up fun, which is, of course, a nice part of it. You know, a romantic relationship should involve fun, doing things together that are enjoyable in a kind of playful way, including banter and jokes and, you know, all of that sort of thing, but also wider friendships. You're part of a bigger network. It's not just the two of you in some sort of silo. But then, in addition, and this is the slightly less pleasant aspect that's part and parcel of the play drive, which is that it also involves power dynamics. There's a you know, who's calling the shots, who's setting the agenda. Successful play involves reasonable balance in that regard. Reciprocity, mutuality, turn-taking, taking account of what's in it for him or her. You know, is this enjoyable for both of us? You know, I'm enjoying myself, but what about my partner? So there needs to be a fair, and the word fair is very important. There needs to be a fairness in terms of this power dynamic. So that's already 4 things: lust, panic, grief, care, and play. Then there's 2 more out of the 7. I'm not going to list all 7 because I don't think fear should be a part of romantic relating. So to the extent that fear is in the mix, there's a problem. But you do need to integrate the other 2, namely rage. Whose partner never frustrated them? It's inevitable that your romantic partner is going to, on occasions, irritate and annoy you. So you need to somehow integrate that into how you relate to each other. What the loving relationship involves has to also involve some management of these kinds of tensions. Rage is obviously too strong a word. If it reaches the level of rage, that's problematical. But you have to deal with irritations and frustrations, and, you know, the other person getting in the way of what you want, and so on occasions. And then lastly is seeking. Not many people are familiar with this drive, but it certainly exists. And it's a need to engage with what is not known. It's felt as curiosity and exploratory interest and so on. And so, to put it crudely, in our loving relationships, on the one hand, in terms of the attachment drives that I mentioned, you know, you want your partner to be with you forever and always. That's attachment. But seeking is always looking to see what else is available, because it's interested in the new, in the novel, in the unknown. And so ideally, integrating seeking into a loving relationship involves always finding something new together, you know, rather than having to look for pastures greener with other people other than your partner. So I think romantic love involves an integration of all of these different emotional needs with each other. And what I haven't made sufficiently clear in my little summation so far is that when I say integration, I mean to include the fact that they conflict with each other. So obviously, as I've just said, attachment can conflict with seeking. In other words, wanting to keep the same person can conflict with wanting to look for interesting new experiences. The 2 attachment drives conflict with rage because, you know, as much as you love your partner, they inevitably also annoy you. And so there's conflict, which gives rise to attachment feelings in conflict with rage feelings, give rise, in the best of circumstances, to guilty feelings. Guilt is what prevents you from acting on your rage. It inhibits it and contains it. But in some people, even the integration of lust with attachment feelings can present conflict. Attachment feelings, if I go back, sorry if I sound like a psychoanalyst, which I am, but if I go back to the origins of those attachment feelings, they fundamentally are mommy feelings, feelings toward mommy. And it's quite hard to bring, and this is incidentally not a sex thing. Boys and girls are attached first and foremost to their mothers for the most part, usually. Of course, it varies, but that's the norm. And those warm, fuzzy, feelings of being loved in the nursery and the nest and so on. It can be quite a task to reconcile those sorts of feelings with crude, lustful, erotic desire. So you get things like forgive the slang, but the so-called Madonna whore syndrome. Where you get people who are able to have satisfying, in inverted commas, sexual relationships with people that they have no attachment to. And then with people who they're attached to, they can't bring sex into it. It's too difficult. So bringing all of this together in romantic love is an enormous achievement. To have a successful, loving relationship is not easy. But that's a very long-winded answer to your question. And let me tell you, there's more. But those are the headlines.
I love that. And there's this little phrase I'm often talking about, or part of this research is about thinking beyond dichotomy and holding the paradox. And I think what you just expressed, and also our romantic relationships can be exercises or practice in trying to hold those things that might seem irreconcilable or as if they're paradoxical in a way that they don't fit together. So I really appreciate that comment. But there's a couple things. One thing I want to get to is you were talking about mostly romantic love, but are we able to talk about love in a different way? For example, Jonathan Lear talks about love as a basic force of human nature. In a way, it's almost just saying that love is all feeling. I want to go there a little bit with you. But before, you said you just sort of dismissed fear. And I know a lot of people think that fear is a very big part of romantic love, the fear of losing the other and all of this. So how you just think that shouldn't be part of it, so you don't want to talk about it? Or have you seen a way in which it's really not actually part of it?
No, sorry. Let me explain. In affective neuroscience, we divide anxiety into two types. The one is fear, which is anxiety about coming to harm, anxiety about danger to life and limb. And the other type of anxiety is panic, which is anxiety about losing a loved object. So certainly that, panic, grief, panic is part of that attachment thing. Panic is the negative expression, of anxiety about separation and loss. That is very much a part. I mean, I've put it in negative terms, the anxiety about loss, but it is a positive thing. I mean, attachment comes with the price of anxiety about loss. That's the pain of separation is the risk we have to take in order to properly attach to somebody. So yes, indeed, that's part and parcel, a big part of romantic love. Fear in the sense of I am scared that this person is going to harm me, hopefully plays an absolutely minuscule part.
Okay, I'm glad I asked you. Yeah, that's true.
Except in divorce, that's when the relationship's coming apart.
So we're looking at a really focused part of this, of between two people, and it seems subjective. It's going to be different for each of us and so on. But I wonder if you've seen regularities, patterns in terms of what love is, or even feeling. If you've seen patterns of this that relate to overall the way a person is in the world, the way we come into being who we are. In your intro, you introduced this developmental aspect of how we come to love and why it's so important. So I'm trying to think of the continuity of it and how it might apply in ways that aren't just between two people in a very specific relationship.
Yeah, so That's a compound question. So let me try and address it, and it will involve a number of steps, I think, in order to address it properly. So let me begin with the statement that you made in passing, attributing it to Jonathan Lear, who I admire and like, incidentally. I spent a year on sabbatical at the University of Chicago, and he kindly had me as a visiting fellow at his what's it called, the Collegium something or other. It's a wonderful interdisciplinary center. Neubauer Collegium, I think it's called.
Oh yeah, okay.
Anyway, I'm getting distracted. So
no, that's great. I mean, the
yeah.
reason I brought up him is Alvin Noe, the philosopher, recommended that book. So, and yeah, it has to do with trying to understand what we talked about in the first conversation in a way of, what is this kind of thing that we share that is feeling? But
yeah. So let me begin there with at a rather basic level. I think what I heard you saying and attributing to Jonathan Lear was that feeling and love might be synonymous. And I think that is self-evidently not the case. We've just spoken about fear. Likewise, rage in and of itself is not a loving feeling. Rage in and of itself is the antithesis of a loving feeling. So just those two feelings, they clearly are feelings. The fact that they exist, and in my view, that they are natural kinds, they are basic emotions that not only all humans are subject to, but in fact, many animals too. So fear and rage are not loving.
I'm not saying that he's saying that all feeling is love, but he is saying that love is a basic force of human nature and that it's a sort of archaic mental process, he calls it, which sounds a lot like, if we think about the brain, sounds very similar to something like Hidden Spring. And also that this was the beginning of a science of subjectivity, in a sense. So you can see how there's these themes that are relative. So I guess the bigger question is, can feeling be understood as a basic force of nature, in your opinion?
Well, I'm sorry that I misunderstood what you said about Jonathan's view. I see it's the other way around, that love is a feeling, and then secondarily, love is a basic feeling. So yes, I think that feeling is absolutely fundamental to our natures. Feeling is how we come to know whether or not we're meeting our needs, and that doesn't apply only to emotional needs. It goes even down to the level of, I mean, try holding your breath for a minute and see what you feel. You feel, air hunger. Try not drinking for a day. Try not eating for dinner, and so on. So try not urinating when your bladder's full. All of those are needs, bodily needs, that we become aware of by feeling them. And the feeling of a distended bladder is unpleasant, and the feeling of avoiding that bladder is a pleasurable relief. Likewise with hunger, thirst, sleep, pain, all of them.
He does bring up, bowel movements and vomiting and things like this as almost expressions of mind. I think he might even say expressions of mind. And he is relating that kind of archaic connection to something like the feeling of love, which doesn't mean we've called it love, and it doesn't mean it's romantic love in the way we were talking about.
Yeah, so I'm trying to take it step by step, and you remember I said it's a compound question, and so to do it justice, I need to divide it into bits. So the first bit, I said not all feelings are loving, and that was because I misunderstood you. Now, because I have understood you, I'm saying yes, feeling is a fundamental part of our natures, and I would go so far, building on what you've just said, I would go so far as to say feeling is what brings into being. The most rudimentary state of mindedness is to feel something. So bodily processes of the kind that we've just been talking about, for the most part, go on autonomically. You're not normally aware of your need for oxygen. It's an autonomic reflex. Peristalsis, which has to do with the extraction of nutrition from the outside world, the processing of all of that goes on automatically, as does blood pressure regulation and a great many other such things. The burning up of the sugars in your fatty tissues, which is absolutely fundamental to your being able to keep going, it happens automatically. So those things, we call them autonomic for good reason, because they're automatic. There's no mind there. But I gave you some examples earlier. I said, try holding your breath, or try not avoiding your bladder, or try not eating, try not sleeping. Then it comes to mind. So this is the body now. To use Freud's definition of drive, it is a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work by virtue of the connection between the mind and the body. So the mind literally comes into being by virtue of the body making a demand which is felt. And why do we feel it? We feel it so that we know through voluntary action, not reflex, not autonomic responses, but through acting in a state of uncertainty in the world. Is this working? Is this not working? Feeling tells you this need is being met, this need is not being met. When we spoke last time, I think I gave the example of being in a burning building, in a carbon dioxide filled room. And you don't know which way to go. You've never been in a burning building before, let alone this one. And the feeling of increasing or decreasing suffocation, distress, or air hunger tells you whether you've made the right or the wrong choice. So the mind comes into being with feeling, which underwrites choice. You choose to do what feels better, and you choose to avoid what feels worse. And of course, you have to tolerate sometimes bad feelings for longer term good feelings, and that's the reality principle. But let's not get stuck in long theoretical grass. So feelings are fundamental. Now we come to love in relation to feeling. I've already said that romantic love is a composite. Now I would say that there are other things that deserve to be called love that are not romantic love. And I think the easiest way to convey that or illustrate that is to take some of those components of romantic love and look at them by themselves. It's clear that what I call, or what we in affective neuroscience call, panic grief, and I'm sorry for the cumbersome term, but that attachment drive, it's clearly loving. It's wanting the love of a caregiver, wanting the love of an attachment figure, wanting their presence, their physical proximity, the soft, warm, fuzzy, that feeling. It's loving. It's not integrated with anything else. By itself, it's a loving feeling. The same with care, that nurturant feeling that I spoke of earlier, wanting to make things better for somebody who's in distress. A baby's crying, and you pick it up and you hold it and you rock it and you say, soothing things to it. It's a loving thing to do, to nurture. So that inclination, which I say again, thank God, is built into our nature. All mammals, have this nurturant instinct, and it's a loving feeling just all by itself. I think that play also is loving. Play is a pro-social, I want to be part of the group. I want to get along with them. I want them to want me to be in the group. I want them to like me. I want them to be my friend. And I want to have friends. I want to be chosen, into that team, and so on. These are all loving feelings. Pro-social. It's wanting to. It's a constructive, joyous, and connected sort of thing, a certain kind of a connection with others, which is very positive and certainly deserves to be called loving. I love my friends. I mean, it rolls off the tongue. So I love being with my, pals, as we say here. So those are three different kinds of love. There are others where other basic states of mind, emotional states of mind, which might also be called loving, but it's a slightly more tenuous kind of love. One of them is seeking. I mean, you could say of a philosopher like Jonathan Lear, he loves knowledge. He loves to understand. He loves to solve a problem. It's a very different sort of thing from the other three types of love that I just mentioned. But you can see why it might be called loving. I mean, I'm a scientist. I know that kind of love, the love of knowledge, the love of engaging with a puzzle and a mystery, and solving it, or at least making progress with it. You can see why the word love starts to be, maybe not everyone would call that love. I'm happy to, but it's a very different thing. And then lastly, lust. I don't know if lust is loving, but I like to think that for most of us it is. It doesn't have to be, and this leads me to the next level of what I wanted to say to you. So I've spoken about feeling, and now I've spoken about these loving feelings, the variety of loving feelings, and I ended with lust. And I said, it doesn't have to be loving. And that takes me back to something that I said earlier. So now I'm coming to the third thing I want to say about this idea of the relationship between feeling and love, and the question as to whether or not love is a basic state of mind. Before I get there, sorry, it's a very complicated story. It's clear that I do think there are kinds of love which are basic states of mind, but they're not the same as each other. So, and there are basic states of mind, of emotional mind, which are not loving, like fear and rage. They're not by themselves loving. So now I'm coming to this last bit, and starting with lust. Freud, in his infinite wisdom, discovered a thing called narcissism. I don't know how we understood anything about the human mind before the concept of narcissism was introduced. But remember,
it seems like it's always been here, but you're right. That's a Freudian idea. I almost forgot that it was.
Yeah. Only 100 and a bit years ago,
wow.
Freud introduced this. In fact, his paper was called, well, in English translation, it's called Narcissism and Introduction. The German title, more literally translated, is Introducing Narcissism. Zur Einführung der Narzissmus. Introducing the concept of narcissism, is the German title. So, yeah, it's a fundamental concept. But Freud initially thought of narcissism only in terms of what he called libido. In other words, the sexual drive, what in affective neuroscience we call lust. And I said to you, well, let me just remind you what Freud said, that the libidinal drive can be directed toward an object, or it can be directed toward the subject, toward the self. That is narcissism. So narcissism is, simply put, self-love. That's what Narcissus suffered, love of himself. He's seeing his reflection in the water and thinking, gosh, that's,
how beautiful.
I think is the most gorgeous thing ever. So that's loving yourself, self-love. And this is linked in Freudian theory. And remember, this is the introduction of the concept of narcissism. It's linked with what Freud called autoerotism, autoerotic behavior. So I mentioned masturbation, which is the most obvious form of autoerotic behavior. And that's why lust does not have to be loving in the sense that I suspect Jonathan Lear's getting at. Self-love, is that loving? Well, highly problematical form of love. So for Freud, development, mental development, progress means transcending narcissism and moving toward object love. Now, in my terms, that involved, when I say mine, I mean affective neuroscience, neuropsychoanalytic terms, that involves the thing I was talking about at the very beginning in relation to romantic love, when I said lust has to be integrated with attachment before it becomes object love, now using Freud's term. So it's not just discharging sexual tension, it's integrating sexual feelings with affectionate feelings. And there you have a sexual relationship. So Freud spoke of the libidinal drive being taking the self as its object, and then you have to move to taking an object, outside object, as your love object. And the way we conceptualize that today in neuropsychoanalysis is it involves an integration of two drives. Freud didn't realize there's a separate drive for attachment. He never accepted that. He thought this was just a disposition of the libidinal drive that can either be self-directed or object-directed. We think the libidinal drive by itself is a not particularly loving thing. It's you might almost call it just a bodily need. But to integrate that with these affectionate currents, and remember what we said about separation and loss, is also to make yourself vulnerable. Now you're in the hands of your object. If you'll forgive the pun, I didn't mean that. Now you're in the hands of your object. He or she might meet your sexual needs, and they might not. They might find somebody more appealing than you. They might, have a headache tonight, and so on. And so, you're vulnerable. That's the moving. I'm starting to illustrate a point here, which is that love, in the sense that I think Jonathan Lear's talking about, as a basic state of mind, in fact, is not so basic. It is basic in relation to each of these drives, the ones that I mentioned as loving, but the integration of them makes for a state of mind that is more deserving of the word love. Now, let me go back to Freud. Freud, having discovered narcissism in the context of his first drive theory, then discovered, I say in inverted commas because I don't believe it's existing. I don't believe in its existence, so I'm not sure he discovered anything. But Freud discovered the death drive, and then came a whole new understanding of narcissism, what we call destructive narcissism, the thing that the Kleinians made so much of. And Freud sums it up pithily in this alarming phrase when he says hatred is older than love, as a mode of relationship to objects. So as far as others are concerned, as opposed to my beloved self, others, my first attitude to the other is hate. This is Freud's view. You have to, and that's because the object is not there for your satisfaction. The object is separate. It's an insult. The object has his or her own needs, and they're not yours. And so, the object frustrates you. Now, so think about the narcissists, maybe even some of your senior politicians. Think about the narcissists, they are horrid people. Their love of themselves is very evenly matched with their contempt toward others, and so this is a fleshing out of Freud's concept of narcissism, that it involves self-love and object hate. Now, in neuropsychoanalytic terms, the way that we understand that, I remember I told you that moving from narcissism to object love sexually involves integration of lust with attachment. Now I'm saying dealing with this aspect of narcissism involves integrating, as I said earlier, integrating your frustrated feelings with your dependency upon the object. So, you can't just give free vent to your selfish demands and expectations, and anybody who irritates you gets booted out of your way. That is narcissistic. A more loving attitude is to recognize, as much as my friend or partner or playmate or whatever, might be frustrating me, I need them. So I have to keep a lid on things. I have to take account of what about their needs, and so that is loving. So now I could carry on, Andrea, from what I've said now. I don't want to take up all of our time making just this one point. So let me just say, you can generalize from what I've said. Each one of our 7 drives has a narcissistic disposition, and that's not loving. Just take, for example, if I can just add one more to illustrate when I say each of them, the care drive, which you might think is quintessentially loving. As I said earlier, many people see their children as an extension of themselves. They're not loving the child. They're loving themselves in the child.
But that's not loving towards the object. Is it still a kind of self-referential love?
Yes.
Okay, because
that's what I'm saying. I'm saying
it's love, but it's not a bigger kind of love. It's somehow stuck in its own loop of okay.
I must confess, I actually remember the day. I remember the moment when I recognized my firstborn child was separate from me. It was an actual realization, was, oh my God, he has his own mind, and so I think, sadly, many parents, it takes quite long to realize that the child is not an extension.
This is interesting because we've been talking about subject-object a lot, and that is what I was hoping to learn from you about a bit in this conversation relative to the subject, is how you see that development. And I think what you've talked about with narcissism shows how it can become turned in on itself in a way. But maybe to get at this, I wonder, Mark, how you think about the difference between all of this we're talking about and mind, or if you already hold those together, not as separate, but as maybe different ways we're talking about it. Because, we're talking about Freud, we're talking about subjectivity, and there's this idea of the science of subjectivity, phenomenology. I believe your work, his work, a lot of work is trying to look at what was once considered not scientific, subjectivity, our own feeling, and yet it's not in opposition to objectivity and so on. So there's a kind of different space opening. So just to come back to that subject-object, and how do you see this as a kind of as a process of development that involves all these words that we often use dichotomously, like body and mind, or do you see those as dualistic? How do you see mind in this process that you've been describing and the way you talked about romantic love?
Well, let's start again with the most elementary part of the answer, which is that I think any feeling state is, so a mind comes into being just by dint of feeling. So to use Tom Nagel's definition of consciousness, an organism is conscious if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism, something it's like for that organism. So an organism that there is something it is like to be is a feeling organism. That's a minded organism. It's a conscious organism. I think that's the most basic state of mind that there can be.
The body itself, do you think of it as conscious? Is life already conscious, or are you talking about something like meta-consciousness when you use the term conscious?
I do not mean meta-consciousness. I mean basal consciousness.
Basal consciousness. Okay,
raw feeling. Raw feeling.
Yes, that's what I...
So that, what you've just asked leads immediately to my second point, which is that, so firstly, you have feeling. Secondly, in other words, developmentally and phylogenetically, secondly, you have states of mind which involve, I feel like this about that. It doesn't have to be in words. It's that there's a feeling, and the feeling extends onto a perception. So now the feeling renders conscious what it's about. Now, there are even human beings, children born with no cortex. It's called hydranencephaly, who are clearly feeling beings. They are emotionally responsive beings. There's something it is like to be them, but it is impossible for them to know what their feelings are about because they have no cortex. They can't make images of the objects that are evoking these feelings in them. So I think that's a second order of consciousness. For me, the first person is just a feeling state. Yeah. The second person is an feeling about an object.
That's a very important point, because those children, which you describe very well in your writing, are conscious. But a lot of people use the term consciousness to mean that they're aware of themselves as a subject in a certain sense, or they can report on it in a certain sense. But it's really that immediate level to begin with.
Yes. Understandably, our own consciousness, most of us, people like you and me who take part in and watch podcasts, we have a very complex form of consciousness. And so we take that for granted. That's what we mean by consciousness, this stuff that you and I are busy engaging in now. But that's an extremely highly developed, complex, compound form of consciousness. So it even goes beyond what I've just said to you. So I think first we have feeling. Secondly, we have feeling extending onto objects. Thirdly, we are able to abstract ourselves from that situation and recognize, oh, it is me. I too am an object. It is me who is feeling that about her. So that's the third person perspective. And that's where most of us live. We live up there in abstract thoughts about our thoughts and feelings.
And we don't understand that continuity, which begins and is still grounded in feeling, raw feeling.
Yeah, it's largely the best way to illustrate it, I think, is to remind people of what it's like to be dreaming. For the most part, you lose that third person perspective upon what's going on. It's just, I feel like this about that. Unless you have lucid dreams, there's no reflection upon, oh, this is me having a dream about such and such. It's just, you're just stuck in the concrete moment. To go back, so there's two things we're talking about, just not to conflate them. The one is what we've just been saying. I say we because it seems we agree, that there's feeling, then there's feeling about objects, and then there's the ability to reflect upon oneself as an object, having feelings about other objects. That's not unrelated to, but not identical with, the transition from narcissism to object love. The transition from narcissism to object love is taking account, ultimately, just to put it very generally, it's taking account of the perspective of the object, recognizing that I depend upon objects and objects depend upon me. And so love, in the sense that I think Jonathan Lear is talking about, it kind of emerges with successful mindedness. I mean, in other words, to have just feelings and to ventilate them is every baby is born like that. I'm sorry to say, baby, it's then it has to realize this person who I'm howling at, I'm entirely dependent upon them, and he or she has needs of their own too, and I can't just demand, and so I think that once you start getting to this interrelatedness, this recognition of the existence of other minds, at this point, love, in the sense that I gather Jonathan is talking about, comes into being, and in line with what I think he's saying, let me add, it is essential. if you can't do that, you're in trouble. If you can't do that, you've got a very this is what Melanie Klein called the paranoid schizoid position, or part object relationships, or part object as opposed to whole object relationships, where the object is just seen as a means to an end in terms of satisfying my needs. But once you start recognizing that the object too has needs, the object too is a subject, then you start being able to love, and it involves a state of vulnerability. I keep on coming back to that.
Yes, and that vulnerability might be one reason people push away from going through that subject-object development. But we keep coming back to Jonathan Lear, but he does talk about Freud as developing a sort of science of subjectivity. And if we had time, I wanted to talk to you about your friend Oliver Sacks. And I wonder how you see this. Do you see science as somehow separate from all of this that we've been talking about? Or are you seeing a way in which all of this is trying to find its place in a larger space together, that we can look at our own consciousness and our own feeling in the way you described, and we can help one another do that as something like science? Or is that different from, for example, the neuroscience, where you're doing very specific experiments with dreaming? And how do you hold those things?
Yeah, so in case some of our viewers don't know this, I have translated Freud's works and revised translations of Freud's works. So I've spent a great deal of time getting acquainted with what exactly Freud's project was. What was he up to? And I think it's not that it's lost in translation. I think Freud doesn't articulate it adequately. That his project fundamentally, I mean, his whole life's work was trying to bring into science, into natural science, the empirical fact of experience, that there is part of nature, it exists, here it is, you and I are observing it right now. Part of nature is the fact that we experience. There is something it is like to be an object that is minded. And this has to somehow be integrated with everything else we know about science. So, with everything and Freud's first efforts are explicitly self-consciously, like his project for a scientific psychology of 1895, he's explicitly and self-consciously trying to provide a mechanistic, by which he means a Newtonian, a mechanics of mental forces and mental energies and mental objects, and trying to use the same language as we use for everything else in nature. Now, that was a very primitive attempt, which was unsuccessful, but it illustrates what Freud's whole scientific effort was about. It was to try to bring subjectivity into science and integrate it with the rest of science, which it must be possible to do unless you take a dualist view and think that we are disembodied souls. If we're not, if consciousness and therefore experience is just part of nature, it has to be possible to weave our understanding of how it comes about, what it does, why it's there, etc., into the fabric of the whole of natural science. Freud called it psychical reality. He's saying part of reality is psychical reality, and we need to understand this part of reality in the same way and in a way commensurate with the ways in which we understand the rest of reality. So that was Freud's project. That is my own project. I've taken on that very same project. I think it's unbelievably important. I don't know why anybody does anything else. What's more interesting and important than that? Now, you mentioned Oliver Sacks. The reason why I first of all contacted him, which was in 1984, that I began my relationship with him, was precisely because I saw, well, here's a neurologist who takes seriously the experience of his patients and thinks that this is valuable information. he didn't do it systematically. He wasn't systematically trying to research subjectivity and its place in neurology and therefore in physical science. But he kind of intuitively knew that unless you take account of the subjective aspect of brain function, you're never going to understand how this part of nature works. Because let me just say that clearly. The most interesting thing about the brain is the fact that it feels like something to be a brain. In other words, the brain has subjectivity. We're not aware of anything else. So, you actually asked earlier, do I think everything feels? I don't think everything feels, but everything with the brain feels. And so the most interesting thing about the brain is that it has this incredible capacity. Unless we understand why it feels like something to be a brain and how this comes about and what the feelings do, because any one of us knows from our own immediate experience that our feelings have causal consequences. It alters what the rest of the body and brain does, the fact that it feels like something to be one. So I think that it is an absolute necessity and a wonder. I mean, I'm thrilled to be studying it just because it's so fascinating, but it is also an absolute obligation on neuroscience and the whole of biology and the whole of natural science to integrate subjectivity into its Weltanschauung, as they say in German, which is kind of like loosely translated as worldview.
Yes,
Picture
I agree.
of the universe.
Yeah, it's already in there too. I think that's part of it too, that you show and Zach shows and other people show in different ways. So we need to recognize it and account for it. And the same kind of movement that you were describing before, that's how we come to know ourselves objectively, is through some sort of subjective experience. But I wonder how you hold it in your own life, because you are balancing worlds. I mean, you, in the traditional sense of objective and subjective, which I'm trying to open the space around, but you have to hold both. And I know both can be criticized, right? People can say that's too subjective or that's too objective, depending on which stance they're coming from in your worlds. So how have you found a way to hold all of that together? Or is it just ongoing? You figure it out day by day?
Well, I've certainly figured things out day by day in the sense that I'm more satisfied with my understanding of these things now than I was 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So yeah, I'm figuring it out as I go along. For me, that book of mine that you mentioned, The Hidden Spring, was a kind of culmination. It was a coming together of, okay, this I think is how it works. Not to say that, please God, I'll live a few more years, that I won't, have better thoughts. But that's as good a understanding as I can come up with. So what I wanted to say about this is, let us not forget that what most people think of as objective reality is also their subjective representation of it. So, a thing like this screen in front of me, it only takes the form that it does because this is how I perceive it. I have these special senses which register these aspects of the world and so on. So for me, the interesting thing, it's not object subject. It's a subjective awareness of the part of the universe that I myself occupy and subjective awareness of the part of the universe that I do not occupy. And then we need a language which can unify both of those. And this is why I consider myself a dual aspect monist. I think that these the so-called physical, which is just, tactile, visual, and so on, auditory, that the way that we register the outside world, as opposed to the affective way that we register our own being. The common underlying reality is inferred. It has to be inferred from perception. You can't ever, and that's a Kantian sort of view. I think that we never will see the face of God, to put it poetically. You only can ever come up with better guesses about the fundamental nature of things. And if you look at what's going on in physics today, it illustrates this very well. We're groping in the dark. We end up with models of reality. It's no accident that what we have in physics today is the standard model. It's a model. So I'll have to end sadly on that. I say sadly because I enjoyed talking to you very much. I enjoy this conversation very much. But duty calls.
Well, thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. You showed us how to hold the paradox. So thanks, and have a great day.
You too. And thanks very much for your interest and for giving me sufficient time to be able to spell out my own thoughts.